The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to the National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar. This webinar is brought to you by the NRSS. Today we'll be focusing on the key aspects of an inquiry which is being held to explore the key factors behind the trend increases in road trauma, the current strategy effectiveness, what can be post-2020 in a new strategy, and really to explore where industry and the workplace may fit in the future in helping reduce workers' road-related risk. Bit of a tongue twister there. So the chairs of the inquiry today will be joining us and walking through the whole process. So we're going looking forward to drawing your insights into it, and we want this as interactive as possible. So for those who don't know me, my name is Jerome Carslake and I manage the National Road Safety Partnership Program and its many activities. So to find out more about the program, please visit the website and register for the newsletter, and you can be kept up to date with everything. So joining us today, we have Ian Johnson. He is the chair of the National Road Safety Partnership Program Steering Committee, and he's been active in it since its inception. Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Jerome, and hi and welcome to everyone.
The other person we have joining us today is Jeremy Woolley. So Jeremy is one of the lead chairs on this program, on the inquiry, and I really look forward to hearing his input today. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jerome.
So we do have John Crozier joining us. He's just having some technical issues at the moment. I'm hoping he'll be dialing in any moment. John, just checking to see if you've joined us yet. No? So when he comes in line, we'll jump in and certainly introduce him. And I have my trusted partner and colleague, Rosemary's looking after getting him all sorted. So in the meantime, we'll continue on. So for those who don't know, the housekeeping for today is basically we have 60 minutes up here, fire the questions in, any issues, any queries you have, we'll hold them through and we'll be able to work through the questions. We're hoping to have as many as possible. We have some themes going through on how this is all going to be structured today. So please make this as interactive, and it's your chance to ask the chairs anything you want. So the structure of today, what we're really going to do first of all is give you a bit of a focus, bit of an outline of the National Road Safety Strategy, how it's tracking, why the inquiry is taking place, and then just quickly before we delve into the meat of the webinar, really exploring the vehicle as a workplace and why it really matters. So why do we have a National Road Safety Strategy, Jeremy?
Yes, well, that's a very profound question. I mean, I'm sure as many of the listeners are aware, one of the situations we have in Australia is the federated nature of things, and we have several different jurisdictions who fundamentally are tasked with the carriage of road safety. They operationalise things, they have the ability to manage police forces and enforcement efforts, they build the roads, and they regulate the driving environment, licences and all sorts of things. So then one does ask, well, where is the place for a national strategy in Australia? We of course have the Commonwealth, and they have jurisdiction over certain things in road safety, and that includes the vehicle side of things. And also they provide a considerable amount of funding for infrastructure projects. But one then does wonder what is the role with the national effort over some other efforts there. And I'd say one thing we need a national strategy for is to stop fragmentation and provide focus. So that is to make sure there is some sort of alignment among the jurisdictions, and it's to reaffirm the aspiration and set the bar somewhere around these things. Now, we can probably go into a discussion a bit later around if the current strategy is achieving this or not, but I'd argue very strongly it's not. And I think there's different models of national strategy we can therefore entertain as a part of this moving forward.
Do you have any comments you want to add at all, Ian? Because I think you might have had something to do with this one back in its development days.
Oh, yes, I don't want to confess too much. No, I'm happy with that. I think we can, it's best probably to move on.
Oh, we'll save this for further. Nice diplomatic answer there, Ian. So how are we tracking, guys?
Yeah, well, if I have a crack at this first, but generally not too well. I mean, we've had long-term downwards trends in the killed and serious injury stats. As ever with these sort of questions, though, you've got to look at the bigger picture. You've got to look at the timeframes involved. and sort of keep that into account as well. But it's quite clear that we're not going to be hitting the targets that were laid out at the commencement of the strategy. Also, I might say, and we can have a discussion later about how aspirational those targets were in the first place. But the consensus, I think, amongst many at the time was they weren't really stretch targets. But we have trended against the targets, and it certainly looks like we're not going to be getting there.
I'd like to add to that the target is one thing, and if you look at it, you say we've got a 30% target over 10 years. Everyone goes, "Oh, that's not too bad. That's a bit of a challenge." But I want to turn the target around the other way. Even if we get to the target, and we're not going to, since we started, the baseline was around 30,000 people seriously injured or killed. And even if we got there, that would reduce it to 20,000. 20,000 times 10 years is 200,000. We're not going to get there. At least 250,000 Australians are going to be seriously injured or killed in the decade that the strategy applies. So you've got to ask whether the 30% reduction aligns with what the community would expect. We just haven't told the community that 250,000 Australians in the decade are going to be seriously injured or killed.
So a large part of the problem I see is the perspective on how we go about tackling this problem. And I feel that over the last decade, one of the clear bits of the messaging that's been lost is this is fundamentally an elimination agenda. We're trying to eliminate the harm that's being done out there. And if you actually let that guide your philosophy around how you adopt solutions and how you go about your task of trying to reduce the harm, you actually end up with different solutions than if you're just chasing a target with incremental gains relative to the scale of the problem.
Great. Well, let's move on now and begin exploring, well, why the workplace?
I think the workplace is certainly in the traditional road safety sense has been a bit of a grey area. There's certainly an intersection there with the workplace and industry at large. And we know that, of course, a lot of business activity and so on is conducted on the public road system. So that opens up all sorts of questions around the safety issue and where it intersects with OH&S. And I often find it a very interesting contrast that you might have safety culture and OH&S considerations within private organisations, but when it comes to the general public or bystanders on the public road system, they're largely forgotten. So I think that's an interesting contrast that we could tease out later as well.
So is that really the opportunity by talking to the workplace today, the level of trauma that's taken place over the last sort of decade leading to where we are now, is that what's led to this inquiry and now exploring what the opportunities for the workplace?
I think fundamentally this inquiry was put in place for a few reasons, but firstly it was a reaction to the upsurge in fatalities that was occurring in 2015-16. Also I suspect there was a bit of a suspicion and indeed a frustration that we probably need a broader view of road safety and indeed a broader systems perspective on tackling the problem. And I think this inquiry was certainly initiated to try to look at those things a bit more deeply.
Fantastic. Well, for those of you who don't know, those who get out there on the road and they drive around the place, really the workplace is, as a vehicle, is one of the most high-risk tasks you can do. So it's the most dangerous thing a lot of people will do. And by comparison, you look at this, so 1 in 7,500 people in mining or quarrying are at risk of dying and suffering death on the roads. Whereas if you travel 40,000 kilometres per annum, it's 1 in 8,000. By comparison, construction, it's 1 in 10,000, and in agriculture, it's 1 in 13,500. But a real key point to push through in this is what an organisation only sees when they actually pay out their insurance costs. There's all the hidden costs that sit behind it. It's the old iceberg story. So what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of organisations will just see the top part without considering the big picture elements, which can be 4 to 15 times what that pure insurance cost can be. Now, and this is some data straight out of Safe Work Australia, who have been focusing on this quite a bit. If you look at the work-related hospitalisations as an example, once again, the male is overrepresented in regards to the vehicle. So 14% are female, 86% are male. But the key part is in total hospitalisations, 17% are from transport-related accidents in the workplace. Now, if we really delve in this a bit further, you can really understand why the vehicle is a high-risk environment, because 2/3 of injuries involve a vehicle in the workplace. So these are some quite staggering figures coming out of Safe Work Australia. And the other interesting thing is this has actually been quite consistent over the last few years. It has not really changed and shifted that much. But the big good news is if you actually consider organisations that are doing it at the right way, building down from the top, and we have numerous case studies pointing on this, is if we really explore it and you look at road safety and you treat it as an investment, what you'll see over time is it will actually impact and reduce your total costs and reduce claims over time. So it's a structural process. It takes quite a while, and we touch on this quite a lot within NRSP, and there's numerous examples, webinars when we really want to explore this. But once again, it has to be treated as an investment, and it takes time. And I think that's one of the key things within the whole road safety space. It's all about takes time in doing things. There is no silver bullet. So now I'm throwing this open to the audience, and we really want to hear from you guys as to what you think. And we want to draw into this sort of discussion. And as Jeremy touched on earlier, before we had the segue in, what are really some of the key sort of issues facing organisations and their workers on the road space? What are the leadership opportunities for industry and sectors to assist? And how does road safety intersect with OH&S? So these are just really acting as guiding sort of principles. And now I'm hoping John might be online better join us. I can see him sitting here. I'm just hoping we can get him online. But I'll pass over to you, Jeremy and Ian, to kick this off.
Yes, thank you. And look, we've got three dot points there, which will trigger the conversation. But I'd be very interested to hear about some feedback around how industry thinks they can contribute to this area more broadly. And also the big agenda item for me is one of innovation. How do we do things differently from what we've been doing in the past? And I'm very interested in mapping that out across private and public sector. And indeed, you know, through into our capacity, knowledge and capacity, who are the people with talent that are out there that we can draw into this space to help us along? And how do we have a broader perspective beyond just the sort of silos that we've been having in the past?
And I guess just to add to that, the second point about leadership opportunities for industry, one of the interesting things about road safety in Australia, it's fundamentally a long time been regarded as the province of government. And I think one of the strengths of the NRSPP is that we're getting industry involved in solving its own part of the problem. And so I think the issue of leadership opportunities is a really critical one.
So what sort of examples are out there? Let's open up to some people. How do you think we can really get organisations on board? And we've got a first one here from Danielle. Should industry leaders take a greater responsibility in establishing negative social images of risky driving behaviour?
I can certainly jump in on that one, and yes, I think we do have a few examples here of big corporate organisations who declared that they're going to adopt safe driving practices and a safe driving culture. And, you know, that's entirely consistent with eliminating some of those images of risky driving behaviour.
And Peter makes the point here, is fatigue management the biggest risk in business?
Well, it's one of the risks there. I think all the risks need to be managed. Certainly fatigue is one of the most challenging areas to deal with, but a proper risk management system is probably going to be the most effective in dealing with it. There's a lot of talk of devices and things we can latch onto, and that's fine. They're all good supporting measures, but a strong safety culture and a top-down management approach is probably the best way to deal with the fatigue issue.
But is a device a silver bullet? Can we use that to help ourselves?
The advice I have back from researchers is no. Again, it's unlikely to work in isolation unless you have that safety culture and the safety management backing it up.
Can I just suggest that if we focus only on fatigue, we're going to miss a series of opportunities. I think one is fitness to drive for whatever reason, whether you're tired or you've taken drugs or your sleep patterns. Well, that gets us back to fatigue, but let's not over focus on fatigue. I think companies have a lot of opportunity to control speed behaviour amongst their drivers as well. That I think is a crucial part of the whole problem.
Well, what about if you look over in the UK, Transport for London is a perfect example. There's a lot of systems they're putting in place there. They're focusing not just on their own local government council, it goes above and beyond the influence organisations throughout the entire UK, and they're reaching further. How do you actually achieve that where you get an organisation like them? How do we sort of bring that philosophy into Australia?
that's where I'd be very interested to hear from industry about what their opinions are on that. Certainly, as an inquiry has progressed, one of the big opportunities I think we've identified is the ability to bring in sort of safety standards or safety considerations around some of the contracts that are being let, and how that might flow onto subcontractors. But we talk about the opportunities with some large construction projects that are going on in the eastern states now, and how that cuts across through to vehicle safety, the driver capabilities, and just improving safety in the areas of operation, indeed outside of the construction zone as well. There must be a great potential to sort of expand that type of philosophy further amongst other industries.
Got a question here from Jay. Do you see great opportunities for training and awareness of mobile workplace risks for OHS students and professionals?
Again, the answer is yes, very much so. And I think we need to, again, broaden the safety consideration and develop that safety culture. And the roads are one of the largest problem areas for OH&S.
Is there evidence that improving the workplace road safety culture and performance will or does flow to people's non-workplace behaviours? Question from David. It's a really good one.
Yeah, I think, yes, I'm not aware of any definitive studies which make that statement, but it stands, there's certain logic behind it. And indeed, the sort of things you're tapping into here with the partnerships program, I think will be a key to socialising these sort of outcomes and making sure others can adopt it.
How do you ensure, though, that the organisation is presenting sort of good practice approaches when they're actually getting the message to their people?
Well, I think it's very important that what the companies do is what there is evidence to support is effective. But I recall that BlueScope did some interesting stuff and found that a lot of their lost time injuries were early in a week following DIY events over the weekend. So guys falling off ladders and damaging themselves with electronic tools and the like, and this goes to the business of whether safety in one domain moves across to another domain, and they put a lot of effort into working with families to decrease DIY and found a benefit flowed back into the industry. So there's, as Jeremy said, there's no concrete evidence that a safety culture within the workplace generally will flow into a safety culture in the employee's private use, but there's every reason to suspect that it's a good way to go, and we ought to evaluate it as it happens.
And we've had John's come online as well, so he will be able to join us if he wishes. So John, please step in at any point you wish to join the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jerome.
Welcome, John. So, question here from Drew. I guess it's looking at the organisational issues. So he's asking, providing a safe workspace on the road, engineering the risks out of roadworks, debris collection, etc., without closing down the road, multiple lanes, increasing traffic congestion, etc. So it's looking at that, I guess, that bigger picture for an organisation.
Yeah, and I think, again, we just need to open up our thinking about this and, you know, not perpetuate the ways of old. I mean, you know, there's benefits to, there's synergies between safety and maintenance as well, and good examples are things like audio tactile line marking, where you can reduce the frequency of hits with barriers and things like that. But I think we just need to be innovative in the way we approach these things. I mean, who knows, in the future you might have autonomous lawnmowers and things like that assisting with the task. And some practices and some jurisdictions are adopting the practices of the railway industry, where you close a road down for a period of time and do everything you need to for that section of road in a very safe environment. So we just need to, again, it's that innovation agenda. We need to start thinking about how we do things differently from the past, and then the solutions will start coming forward.
I guess just drawing on Drew's question a little bit further, because I'm quite intrigued by it. How do we also get ownership moving beyond just them as the road workers and the people doing the risk? How do we get the public to view them and see them and understand the risk from their view?
Well, I think, I mean, it's the understanding of the role of the road system and what it takes to maintain it and why we're putting this effort into it. But by and large in this country, we've sort of done very poorly at communicating the risk and the sort of standards we try to maintain around this. And I think, you know, it's all part and parcel of sort of communicating that we need to maintain a certain safety profile and standards on the roads. And there's certain ways we need to go about ensuring that that continues.
Got a question here from Simon. What about actual product vehicles, machinery on the road? So I guess it's drawing on your earlier question. So where does the technology focus on actually taking that step?
Almost elements from these systems, and it's changing the mindset of matters, which is how can we make the most from these technologies that are coming our way. And indeed, the transition over the next 30 years will see massive reductions in trauma if we can embrace these technologies in the right way. But there will be a transition, and we're going to have to adapt and adjust accordingly.
Okay, just a question here from Julie. So I'm sorry, Julie. That was Jeremy speaking just then. He's been sharing. So John's just come online as well. So John, would you like to add anything at all?
Picking up the point around the workplace safety, the analogy with school zones I think is a good one. And there was a lot of resistance to accepting a 40-kilometre speed limit. That actually took quite a long time to persuade the community of the safety benefit. A large education period was required, the visible signage, but it's been critically the steps taken to enforce. And again, my strong sense is we need to be much more routine in the enforcement of 40-kilometre speed zones around those places of temporary work. Jeremy did make reference to overseas experience or the railway model, completely quarantining corridors or components of corridors while that workplace is underway. My sense is that we need those compromise solutions and the promulgation of the mandatory 40-kilometre an hour, but also mandatory placement of speed cameras as a routine at those places of work.
Thanks for that, John. Outside of work, do we think that this practice could be useful to transport industry in general? So I guess one of the points is drawing on that further is how far should an organisation go in managing its risk, and it sort of goes into people's personal lives as well.
And I think my response to that is that safety culture is evolving, and you're always striving to improve the situation. I think that sort of a development is entirely consistent with trying to achieve the best possible standards and and make the profession as professional as possible. So I would think that these things would flow in certain sectors, and why not for the road transport industry?
And companies can make guidelines for what their people do in their own time, but ultimately it's going to be the development of some kind of assessment of fitness for work when they arrive is going to be the telling intervention.
Great, thanks for that point, Ian. Got a question here from Courtney to both of you, and of course John as well. What do we need to get OH&S authorities investigating vehicle crashes in the workplace along the same lines as other OH&S incidents? Great question.
It's a very good question, and it alludes to what I was talking about earlier around the intersection of road safety and OH&S often being a grey area. I'd like to think that as we move on into the future, the safety culture will change so that we do start conducting proper investigations around these things. But we've got to treat every crash as a systems failure, and that's fundamentally the issue we have moving forward. And at the moment, I sense that a lot of the burden of investigation and so on sits with police, but it's predominantly around culpability and the circumstances around a prosecution. So I agree, there's certainly a gap there that needs to be filled, and we are trying to push that agenda on several fronts.
John, would you like to add to that at all?
Just to make the point that the model for the Australian Transport Safety Bureau's mandatory investigation of aircraft-related crashes. There are repeated calls across a number of the submissions for that same process of analysis to be used in fatalities involving heavy vehicles. So there is certainly a broader-based appetite for more detailed investigation. And as Jeremy has said, it's more for systems analysis than it is for the police focus, which is predominantly about a prosecution.
Now, I was almost touching on the point that Thomas raised as well. So thank you very much for that. Question here, which I really like from Dennis. What individual worker interventions are in place to ensure workers with the right attitudes, lowering behavioural risk, etc., and capabilities such as attention, decision-making, awareness of traffic are on the road?
Well, again, I think that boils down to the organisation they're working for and the safety management culture in the organisation. But again, a lot of organisations do default to the general road rules and the general deterrence of enforcement efforts on those roads. But the most success does come out of those organisations with a developed safety culture. And you need to actively manage these things and reinforce the importance of them through your management activities. It's no good just handballing the problem to the employee and saying drive sensibly and not following up with anything.
And I just touching on that as well. Is there a crossover between the Safe Work Australia strategy, which they have, and the National Road Safety Strategy? Do the two ever touch each other?
I think there has been some mapping out, and currently there has been a project recently which seeks to look at that intersection of the two and provide advice through that, and that's been channeled through Safe Work Australia. So others may be able to comment more than myself, but again, that sort of thing is starting to fall under the microscope now. People are actively thinking about things in this space.
Ian, were you going to touch on something then?
Only to say that there are And in addition, the monitoring of performance, which I think companies can do extremely well, and then call their own drivers to account when necessary.
And another question we have here, which I really like, I think this really goes back to the crux of organisations. So this one's from Brett. The old time is money puts pressure on employees, both implied and explicit. I've never met a courier driver who has not been in a hurry. This would apply equally to tradespeople and the like. So a top-down approach needs to be across many industries. So time is precious, time's worth money. How do we translate that into the vehicle guys?
Absolutely, and that's all part of that safety culture we try to build in, and an evolutionary safety culture. And again, you can draw analogies to rail, aviation. I mean, all these sectors, time is money as well. But safety is a #1 priority, and they factor that in their day-to-day operations.
John, do you have anything to add at all?
No, I just again endorse what Jeremy has rightly said there.
How far along the supply chain do you go? Obviously, you have chain responsibility flowing in to the heavy vehicle sector, and there's a big focus on that, and we're just about to change very soon. Over in Western Australia, chain responsibility applies down to like commercial vehicles, but on the East Coast it doesn't. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, we've certainly got to push a culture of safety more broadly, and I think in years gone by, it's just too easy to disassociate yourself from the safety implications, and we certainly do need to look to move into an area where everyone has a role to play and everyone understands what their contribution is. Chain of responsibility is a very important step in the right direction in that regard, but we've still got a long way to go in passing that up and down the chain. But at least with the chain of responsibility provisions, we've got the basis for moving that forward.
And I guess, of course, we're going to touch on data at some stage. I've got a good question here from David. What data information do you think is missing to better understand workplace fatalities, serious injuries?
The over 40,000 that are hospitalised, and by definition, at the beginning of the strategy, serious injury was defined as a hospitalisation of 24 hours or more. We're not good at jurisdictional level in aggregating that data close in time to the presentations. We're poor at sharing what information we do collect across state boundaries, and to try and get a snapshot close in time to the event for the whole of Australia is a big ask, but it is what is required. Currently, and the analogy is a good one, I can't claim credit for it, but we spend at least $27 billion per year on the management, much of it the hospital costs and medical costs of those 44,000 or thereabout hospitalised for at least 24 hours in our emergency departments and hospitals all the way throughout Australia. The reality is, though, we're working with data at least 4 years old, and a government or a board that was, in essence, running a business that was spending $27 billion and modelling their business on data 4 years old would be required to show cause why they should still sit on the board. We are largely, one of the key things with the medical component, I guess, of the review is to identify where gaps are, try and work out how we can better provide the data. One of the key requirements in the hospitals is to try to link the geoplot of where the incident occurred to the health record, the health costs that subsequently follow. There are some jurisdictions that are further along that journey than others, but again, a lot of benefit will flow if we habituate the linkage of the geospatial data of where the crash, which results in the injury requiring hospitalisation, linking those two data sets. And the data is pretty rich, 44,000 data points at least, in contrast to the 1,250 or thereabout points where death has been the coding variable.
I might also chime in there and say that, I mean, one of the challenges we face moving forward is the metrics we use to measure progress as well. And we need to, have a much stronger culture of looking to the intermediate measures and measuring those and socialising those. So at the moment, the data is very fragmented and it's spread all over the place. We probably will never get to a situation where we have a one-size-fits-all database that serves every need. But where we need to head to, again, is an understanding of the system operation, and how, again, that perspective that each crash is actually a systems failure. And if we don't acknowledge the biases in various data we're using, we'll be forever perpetuating the old problem and not looking for opportunities elsewhere to find solutions.
Do you think on that data one, there's a good leadership? Obviously, quite often we're looking at industry and we're not capturing the workplace within government. Is there a way where government could show a bit of leadership and actually present their data as to how they're travelling, how their workforce is going, and then hopefully maybe open the door to industry to follow suit?
I think a common theme that we're identifying through the inquiry is that lack of transparency. So the data can be hard to get through. It's a bit of a black box at times. But conversely, I think we can put the shoe on the other foot and say, well, industry sectors can actually step up to this challenge as well. Why not provide a snapshot of what's going on in your sector and lead the way around an understanding of the systems as a whole and where the other opportunities may lie? And then you can tap government on the shoulder and say, how about looking at this, and here's the evidence.
And it all does begin with at the individual company level. If a company doesn't accept responsibility for understanding its own problem, then you're not going to get an industry-wide picture, or even a sector-wide pictures within a construction industry or a retail industry or a courier industry or whatever. But the companies have to understand the best kinds of data for them to collect to address their own work-related road safety problem.
So I guess we'll put some of those questions out there, because I guess do some industries have problems or knowing what data they should be collecting, do you think? How do I measure it?
Yes, basically. But we just need a greater understanding of things. And at the moment, things are sort of aggregated to the extent where you can't make sense of you can't drill down into the detail. And, a very good example is even our one-size-fits-all approach to the national road safety problem. I mean, the difference between rural, remote and large metropolises is quite staggering. You need different approaches in each, and you need to acknowledge you might need to measure progress in different ways.
Well, here's a question, just I guess beginning to move us into the future a little bit from Jay. I would like to see greater responsibility from organisations like Uber towards fatigue and fit for work, given so many drivers are also full-time workers in other fields. Do you see a way this can be mandated or encouraged by the government?
I think it's a good question. I think Uber has been disruptive on all sorts of levels, and I think the safety considerations is certainly one of the areas that needs further consideration. I guess that again, it points to the lack of agility or ability to deal with the disruption as we move forward. And I guess while I'm not answering the question, I am pointing out that we're going to have to be far more agile in the future as these disruptive forces emerge. And the whole concept of future mobility and so on is largely disruptive. We're not even close to being in a position to consider the appropriate things to make sure safety is top of mind when these things happen.
And the question is whether you can regulate safety in that sense within a company or a suite of companies, or whether it's better to sheet home accountability to the senior management within that company for a poor safety outcome. So these are issues that I think have not been systematically addressed yet.
John Crozier, if I could speak
John,
up,
of course.
We've talked the stick approach. If we look at the carrot approach, and again, it is the Ubers, the Alphabets, the Googles, where there is a data-rich environment now, and people gift so much data on themselves with their mobile phones, with their Fitbits, rather than using that data in a regulatory sense. A number of, and I'd cite health insurers or and particularly a South African group, give every member a Fitbit. The data is then used to record good health behaviours. As part of the contract, the visa records, the purchase choices of foods, all of that big data is incorporated against the member, and actuarial analyses are used by the fund to work out which behaviours to incentivate with reduced premiums. Now, that is a particularly effective model in terms of the profit of the company. It's beneficial for the members. They're not going out of their way to provide that data. They're utilising the data that's beaming, continuously from their phones, from their Fitbit, each electronic transaction where a purchase is made. There are ways I think we can and we probably should be looking at doing those sorts of things to incentivate the better behaviours. I praise Tim Trumper, the recently appointed chair of the board of the NRMA. He's recently linking it to good traffic infringement or absence of traffic infringement records, potentially sees a reduced premium from the NRMA. So long answer, but the short of it is, I think we also do need to be looking at technological ways of incentivating behaviour.
Thanks for that, John. I think I'm going to combine two questions here because I think it's a perfect segue. Of course, we're going to have one about mobile phones. So I guess, how can we get better change safety attitudes towards mobile phone use in driving and the perception of safety versus doing business?
And I mean, likewise, it would be in everyone's interest to sort of go from A to B at twice the speed limit, but we don't do it. We do draw a line in the sand around these things. I don't see that's necessarily any different with mobile phones, but I think the challenge with mobile phones is, again, we need a system-wide solution and not just putting it continuously back on the user of the phone itself. Of course, you can extract better performance that way, but we do need to help back up the right culture and nudge them in the right direction.
I guess that's one of the question we can sort of segue into Ian a little bit as well, because I know your low-level speeding sort of question. It's a similar sort of thing. I can use my mobile phone all the time. I don't really realise I'm at risk, but just like with low-level speeding. What are your thoughts, Ian?
Well, I think that's the problem in this whole field, that do people want to be safe? Yes, of course they do, but they don't realise when they're unsafe. And that's the kind of horns of the dilemma we've got. And the speeding example is a classic. I think that there is a reward every time you overtake a vehicle that's been impeding your journey. And the fact that you've exceeded the speed limit to do so, nothing has gone wrong. So you say, okay, there's no issue with that. But we know from the research, and the research is absolutely clear cut, if we can reduce the speed distribution across the board, the number of casualty crashes and the number of injuries decreases. But of course, at an individual trip level, it doesn't fall down to an individual seeing the benefit. It's a bit like immunisation. If everybody gets immunised, then a particular disease disappears. But if you get immunised, it doesn't follow that you're going to protect yourself, but you weren't necessarily the one who was going to get the disease anyway.
So I guess just going a bit further, so from Noel, question he's asking here, is a leadership example a major trucking company limited speed of all trucks to a maximum of 90 kilometres per hour, which results in no significant delays in travel time, significant savings in fuel, and presumably less serious road crashes at the same time, whilst resulting from a lower maximum speed?
Absolutely, yes.
So it's interesting that I happen to know which company that is, and I won't say who they are, but the incentive for that speed reduction was a saving on fuel consumed and a saving on actual maintenance. So the safety benefit was not really part of the decision equation, and I'm not even certain it flowed. But the point I think that's followed is that the time loss, which everyone thinks is extreme, just didn't happen.
Has there been discussion around remuneration and the link to serious injuries, e.g. hourly versus KLM or pay rates per parcel rates? So it sort of draws in a little more specifically on one of the earlier questions we had, and that's from Thomas. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, look, I think there's others who are more knowledgeable on this topic than I. I know we've received some submissions on the topic, but I haven't got my head around them yet. But certainly with the recent remuneration backpedaling, I guess, that went on, I mean, it's not as if these sort of things came out of nowhere. There was a lot of effort behind them. They took years to set up, and there are some very considered decisions made around it. So I sense there still is further scope there to look at these things, but we're not quite yet there with the community and various industries.
There's a lot of controversy about rates of pay, and I'm not sure that we have clear evidence one way or the other at the moment. I know what sounds logical, but I'm not sure we've got evidence that translates into outcomes yet.
So I guess we've got one here around safety culture. And I think this is always a crucial thing in successful organisations. So safety culture within organisations has been around for a while. What are the key aspects of a safety culture that are being spoken about today? Are they different from those of the recent past? That's from David.
I think for me, the big thing is that self-improvement aspect. You know, you're constantly striving to improve and innovate. And also it's that monitoring management area where you collect the right metrics, you understand what's going on, and you're constantly monitoring performance. Those are the two standouts. And, you know, of course, the evolution of these things is that you start self-investigating your own incidents and near misses and things like that. So it becomes a part of business as usual. And, you know, that's particularly strong with the airline industry and so on. We can see replications of that starting to emerge on organisations using the public roads as well.
And another characteristic of a strong safety culture is it comes from the top. It comes often from the board and from the most senior management. Because if you don't have that commitment to safety, it's very, very difficult to build a culture through the organisation.
And John Crozier, I'd endorse that really strongly. If it would look at driving practice, the enforcement of safe work hours, a whole range of those embedded safety practices pay great dividends for the big corporates in the trucking industries. The difficulty comes to the smaller contracts where it's the subcontractors who don't have the margins, who are working on much smaller scales, and the question really is how you translate that safety culture to those smaller entities in the logistics space.
So I've got a question here from Brett. From my experience, WHS within both small and large organisations don't seem to assess trips to and from work as a hazard, or often travel between work sites. Typically, the hazards are identified are site-based. Thoughts?
Yes, spot on. Indeed, they haven't, and I'd like to think that we'd evolve to a situation where they were a part of the equation there and actively managed and considered. And I think and again, I think it's a requirement for broadening our thinking on these things and the full spectrum of how we manage safety. I think that the clock scheme around construction sites is a promising development, though, because that indicates that they're thinking outside of the construction site. What is the impact of this activity on the community around? What's the potential risk beyond just my drivers and my vehicles? Certainly, I think that broader thinking should be brought into the industry around starting and commencing shifts. And as Ian constantly alludes to, it's around that fitness to drive issue as well.
We have a question here from Stephen. So great pressure on businesses to bring change to safety culture on road, but how can we educate the private user of the huge role they play in accident reduction and causal factors in the transport workplace?
So I think a lot of the discussions we've been having already sort of reinforce that you get the best success where it's a very strong message top down, and how risks are managed in the organisation. And the sort of notion of enforcement keeping things going, but there's no real clear understanding or appreciation of the risks involved.
So another one here from Brent. Air and rail has been mentioned as having both good systems. Both have a push for time is money. However, I imagine both are heavily regulated in comparison to roads. Is more regulation required in the road space?
Then we can take advantage of. Who's looking at the big picture and identifying the non-regulatory approaches to things where we can find solutions? And we still haven't done enough offer some benefit around that topic. I feel there's no sort of holistic view of that at present.
What can we do to get all levels of government leading the way for safety for their own workplace vehicles? From Henry.
I think more accountability around the metrics we put forward. So, we do need to have developed metrics around progress, and just merely responding to the injury statistics is not sufficient. In fact, many things can sort of explain the industry injury statistics moving around. But with that comes, a diffuse situation where no one's directly accountable for those. And you can talk about components of the system, and people can point to enforcement or new vehicles or all these things, but we need a greater sense of direct line of accountability. And I think it's the core things that have done in industry, of course, which is around defining projects, putting timelines on them, but also explaining the consequences of not meeting those objectives or those timelines. And we need more of a focus on the residual problem that still remains. At the moment, we suffer from a lack of problem definition and defining the actions in response to those, I think.
What about just drawing that, teasing out a bit further, what are the contracts? And what happens if it's a major contract and all of a sudden you're falling behind a little bit and then the call comes on, well, let's just get the job done?
Well, again, that calls to the organisation's culture, isn't it? And you know, you do things in a certain way, and there's a right way and a wrong way around doing that, and that's a top-down approach in many organisations. I think the perspective on road safety needs some attention, though. And in the past, I mean, you know, when decades gone by, it's very much an emphasis on the road user, and the performance of the system as a whole, and so on, is down to the expectations on the road user. You know, that knowledge and our paradigm around that is shifting, I'd like to think, and it's more around finding solutions across the system. And as we know in an OH&S, it's very much about controlling the environment, putting barriers in place or substituting and so on. We just haven't evolved as far as that with road safety. So it's all too easy to step back and say, well, people shouldn't be using their phones or they shouldn't be speeding. But we tend not to investigate other opportunities to
I mean, ultimately, we might have a technological solution, and I think the telcos are accepting a lot more responsibility for some of the downsides but we're not going to give the current young generation are not going to give up this access to the mobile phone at all quickly or easily. So we have to work out how to manage this, and enforcement's not going to be the answer. You've only got to talk to the police about how difficult it is to enforce. So again, as Jeremy said several times, it's about being innovative about how we manage a problem that we never had before.
John, you want to add something?
Yeah, just picking up again and emphasising the primacy of the metrics as the feedback. And embedding safety, as a prime requirement in ways that many of the benefit cost analyses currently do not. Many of the contemporary models are using somewhat historical cost modelling for serious injury or fatality. A lot of that understates the actual the real costs. The mine industry, I think, is an exemplar of serious injury or fatality. Would hit the chair of the board and most of the board within seconds of occurrence. We need the same notification processes, notification by exemption or by occurrence at the appropriate level, be it the state, be it the federal government, in ways that we simply aren't now. I'd commend what I'd seen with Jeremy last week at Neura, presentations by Transurban and depictions of the geoplots of where fatalities had occurred on some of the infrastructure building that's going on apace in Sydney. Most alarmingly, though, the plot that showed the serious injury and exactly where they were occurring, that level of evidence presented to the agent responsible in a more timely way, that's a clarion call to action. And currently we simply don't have, we're not doing that. We're not generating the plot. We're not actually tracking the metric, and we're not embedding the safety payoff as part of an infrastructure build in the way that we should.
Thanks, John. And we have so many questions, by the way, so I do apologise for those I don't get through. So thank you very much for everyone being so interactive. So we've heard about infrastructure, we've heard about the people. So I've got a question here from Simon. How can vehicle machinery manufacturers better assist the issues faced by organisations?
I think they're doing a lot to assist already. I mean, they are designing vehicles with a lot of safety in mind. In fact, some of the biggest advances in road safety over recent years has been around asset protection or occupant protection. We're getting into an era now where, of course, active systems are starting to play their role. There's a bit of an issue between uptake and the sort of having these devices fitted, a suite of these devices in the vehicles. And what I'd like to think is that we could get to a situation where there's industry demand, where industry is clamouring for these things, looking at the business cases around them, and it's pretty clear cut. They can demonstrate that by having these things fitted, it can deliver the benefit further down the line. So it's a bit of a two-way thing here, a bit of supply and demand there. But certainly there are some very good examples of large organisations who have virtually set the scene for the vehicle industry, who have had to respond if they were to continue maintaining supply to the fleet. And that's, another way that this safety has been pursued. We could do the same around expectations around contracts and who we engage with to do our business.
Do you think government would ever be willing to put those sort of mandates into their contracts?
Well, they certainly ought to. And I agree with Jeremy that there's been some fantastic advances in both passive and active safety in vehicles. But the one area that really isn't changing and that's critical is speed. The acceleration performance, the top speed capability and the like. And so we see speed limiters in heavy vehicles, but they can be tampered with. We see the ISA system, the speed adaptation. These are things that I don't think are being explored to anywhere near the degree that they ought to be at the moment, and yet they hold enormous potential. So there's still some reluctance on the part of the vehicle industry, both light vehicles and heavy vehicles, to seriously embrace the notion of speed management.
And Jerome, if I could just pick up on those points and endorse both Jeremy's and Ian's, the choice of vehicle safety features is very much at the purview or direction of the fleet manager, and a range of government fleet purchases are with the intention of getting many of those enhancements in vehicles. Well beyond where the Australian design rules would see imported vehicles standards as they come into the country. Those then find their way out into the vehicle fleet to both decrease the age of the second-hand vehicles out in Australia, but embed a higher level of safety features within them. So again, around the country, it's been pleasing to see a range of government fleet purchase decisions where safety is a very significant component of those choices, increasingly supplanting environmental considerations with those fleet purchase decisions.
Thanks, John. And I do apologise for everyone. I have a plethora of questions sitting here, which I'll be handing over to John and to Jeremy to help inform their inquiry. And if you have more, please feel free to shoot them through. But I guess in the last sort of closing minutes of the webinar, I'd just like to quickly hand over to Jeremy and ask him for what are 2 or 3 things he's heard, and then for John as well. So if you could please do that.
Yeah, look, I think the discussion on the role of regulation and where the responsibility lies, is it the carrot and the stick, is forever present. But I think, again, it's that call for agility, innovation. We need to be receptive to doing things differently there. So it's in that context, I think, that discussion will be monitored with a lot of interest. Data and KPI certainly employee. So how do we sort of reinforce the correct behaviours? How do we make sure that safety is considered beyond just the individual road user or the employee in an organisation?
John, would you like to give your 2 bobs? And then we'll also be asking Jeremy to tell us exactly how people can respond and continue on this as well. So John.
I'd echo what Jeremy has said there, Jerome. It is that disparity in behaviour between the individual and the company. The paramount requirement for contemporary data set and the appropriate choice of metrics. And I'd highlight that from the serious injury point of view, that we have potentially a lot more data that could be used to inform the quality of policy, the quality of safety improvement in infrastructure, if we had a more timely provision of a better metric around serious injury. The other key point, I think, common to a lot of the discussion is distraction. and the role of technological solutions perhaps to what is arguably a key component of a lot of the currently preventable crashes.
Fantastic. Jeremy, back to you.
Yes, well, firstly, I'd just like to thank the National Road Safety Partnerships Program for this opportunity. I think it's been wonderful that we can get such a large audience together on this critical issue. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-chair, John Crozier, who's been contributing today, but also Rob McInerney and Lachlan McIntosh, who are official advisors to the inquiry. They all provide critical input, and for those of you who are aware of those individuals, you'll be understanding of the great wisdom we hold on the panel for the inquiry. I'd just like to point out that the inquiry will be drawing to a close, and we're looking to deliver a draft report by the end of April. That date is extremely ambitious, but be as long as possible so we can take those views on board as we bring this to a conclusion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much, John, for taking the time to share in the inquiry. Thank you very much for my chair of the steering committee for the NRSP, Ian Johnson, for joining in. And I hope you can join us for our next one. And for those unaware, we have the ARB conference coming up. We'll also have a stand there. We'd love to have you come along and join us. Go to the NRSP website, register for the newsletter, and you can be kept up to date. So thank you all again for your time and the audience for being so interactive.